What if one stormy night, a veteran and his loyal dog uncovered a danger that threatened not just themselves, but the whole town? Jack Miller thought his battles ended overseas. But when Rocky froze under the rain, ears up, body tense, they stumbled into a truth hidden in the dark. What they faced that night would test Jack's courage and awaken a community that had almost forgotten how to stand together. This is not just about survival. It's about how loyalty and faith can turn fear into hope, and how one man and his dog became the heart of a town. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you love stories of courage, loyalty, and community, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. The air of late September in rural Ohio carried the scent of damp soil and distant hay, while the maples on the edge of town had already surrendered their first golden leaves. Sunlight fell in fractured beams through heavy clouds, soft yet restless, casting long shadows across the meadows and the wooden cabin where Jack Miller lived his quiet exile. Jack Miller, 45, stood at the threshold of his cabin, a weathered man shaped by war and years of labor. His chestnut hair was short, streaked with silver, and a thin silver-threaded beard traced his square jaw. His skin bore the burn of Middle Eastern sun and the calluses of lumber work. A faded beige shirt clung to his frame, tucked into worn jeans, the knees pale from years of kneeling, and his brown boots carried the dust of the sawmill. His gray eyes, steady but never still, betrayed the restlessness inside him. He looked like a man who belonged nowhere, not to the battlefield that scarred him, nor to the small town that tolerated him. Inside, the cabin was sparse: a cot, a table carved from old timber, a kettle left blackened by years of use. Jack had built much of it with his own hands, each nail driven like an anchor against drifting too far into memory. But walls cannot silence nightmares. Every night, the echoes returned. Convoys in the desert, the blast that carved a crescent scar into his temple, the faces of men he could not bring home. Jack often woke with his body taut, sweat cold on his skin, his hand instinctively reaching for a rifle no longer there. He carried the weight of PTSD like a hidden tattoo, unseen by others, yet seared into his marrow. Rocky stirred beside him. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, sable-coated with a black saddle running the length of his back, his amber eyes bright even in low light. His build was solid and confident, muscles shifting beneath wet fur when he shook himself after a morning drink. Jack had found him at the county shelter, where the dog had paced restlessly, ears always high, a scar on his hind leg betraying neglect. That day, Jack had seen something in Rocky's gaze, a reflection of his own guarded watchfulness. The adoption clerk, a young woman with freckles and a sympathetic smile, had said, "He's loyal, but he doesn't trust easily." That had sealed it. Jack knew loyalty too often began in mistrust. Now, Rocky was his companion, his sentinel. The dog's presence grounded him in ways therapy never had. When the nightmares came, Rocky would press close, wait warm and steady, pulling Jack back from deserts of memory into the small cabin in Ohio. Jack often whispered, "You're all I've got, buddy." And Rocky would lift his head, ears pricked, as though he understood the burden hidden in those words. Jack's days were spent at the sawmill on the edge of town. Men there respected his strength but knew little of him. He was efficient, silent, always arriving early, leaving late. At lunch breaks, while others swapped stories about family or fishing trips, Jack sat apart with Rocky, feeding him scraps of bread. People admired the dog, children approached with wide eyes, eager to pat his sable fur, but their parents would draw them back, uncertain how to bridge the gap with Jack. He didn't blame them. His silence was a wall, one he had built out of necessity. Words cost more than he could pay. One afternoon, as Jack stacked lumber onto a truck, an elderly woman approached the mill road with a basket in her arms. Mrs. Thompson was known to everyone in town, a widow in her 70s, her frame small and wiry, her gray hair always tucked beneath a knitted scarf. Her eyes, pale blue and kind, missed nothing. She had lived long enough to see war take her husband, and loss had made her gentle rather than bitter. She waved toward Jack, her hand trembling slightly from age. "Mr. Miller," she said, voice soft but firm, "you'll freeze yourself working in those thin clothes when autumn deepens. Stop by my porch later, I've got something for you." Jack frowned, unused to kindness offered without demand. He nodded once, wiping sawdust from his arms. That evening, when he returned, a bundle of firewood and a loaf of fresh bread waited at his cabin door. He never saw her leave it, but Rocky's nose would twitch whenever the basket arrived. Jack whispered, "She reminds me of my mother," though his mother had passed decades before. It was these small gestures, quiet, almost invisible, that chipped at the stone around his heart. Children in town had also taken to Rocky. On the path from the mill, a group often waited, their laughter rising as they ran toward the dog. One boy, freckle-faced and lean, would call, "Rocky, guardian angel." Rocky would wag his tail, lowering his head to let them stroke his ears. Jack stood apart, unsure, hands in pockets. Yet, in those moments, when their eyes met his without fear, he felt a fragile thread pulling him closer to the community he had abandoned in silence. At night, Jack often sat on the porch, staring across the fields where maples turned red and gold. The wind rustled dry grass, carrying with it memories of sandstorms and gunfire. He thought of men lost, of comrades who would never know autumn again. His chest would tighten until Rocky pressed his head against Jack's knee. That simple weight was enough to remind him that life, however fractured, still demanded attention. He wrestled with contradictions, the desire to belong against the instinct to remain alone, gratitude for kindness against suspicion of pity. Jack's mind often echoed with questions. Could he be more than the sum of his scars? Did his community see him as broken, or did they wait patiently for him to return to them? The answer, perhaps, lay not in words but in gestures, the bread on his step, the laughter of children, the steady gaze of his German shepherd. Rocky, with his tense ears and unwavering loyalty, taught him that watchfulness was not only for war, but also for protecting what little peace they had found. By the end of September, the cabin no longer felt like exile, but something approaching sanctuary. Jack knew his wounds would never vanish, yet in the eyes of his dog and the quiet kindness of neighbors, he sensed the possibility of healing. For the first time in years, he dared to think that broken men could still find a place where autumn light turned wounds into shadows, and shadows into something softer. The storm came quickly, rolling across the Ohio fields with the sudden fury that only summer can conjure. Clouds thickened, thunder rumbled like distant artillery, and then the rain fell in sheets, turning the dirt road by Jack Miller's cabin into a river of mud. Jack stood under the small overhang of his porch, beige shirt clinging to his shoulders, while Rocky pressed close, ears twitching at every crash of thunder. For Jack, storms were dangerous. The pounding of rain against tin reminded him of machine gun fire, and lightning split the sky like mortar rounds. His breath shortened, chest tightening, but Rocky nudged his leg and let out a low bark as if to say, "You are here, not there." Then came another sound, faint but unmistakable, a human cry. It was weak, desperate, carried by the wind. Rocky's body stiffened, ears pricked high, and he barked again, sharp and insistent, tugging at Jack's jeans as though to pull him into action. Jack hesitated only a moment. Instinct still ran through his veins. He grabbed his raincoat, pulled the hood low, and followed Rocky down the muddy path. Not far along the road, the glow of headlights cut through the curtain of rain. A delivery truck had skidded sideways into a ditch, its wheels half buried in muck, steam rising from the hood. Two men struggled in the storm's chaos. One had slumped against the door, motionless except for shallow breaths. The other waved frantically, soaked to the bone. Rocky leapt forward, barking, circling the men protectively. Jack pushed through the rain. "Stay calm," he shouted over the storm. "We'll get you out." The younger man, barely in his 20s, lanky with sandy hair plastered to his forehead, gasped with relief. His name was later learned to be Eddie Harper, a part-time driver earning money while finishing community college. His freckles stood out against pale skin, his eyes wide with fear but also gratitude. He explained between coughs that his uncle, slumped against the truck, was injured. The uncle was Tom Harper, a man in his 50s, stocky with a broad chest that now rose unevenly. His dark beard was streaked with gray, his face lined not only by age but by years of heavy labor. A retired steelworker, Tom had been stubborn his whole life. He once stayed on the factory floor during a fire to help a coworker escape, a choice that left him with a permanent limp. That same stubbornness had driven him to keep driving even as the storm worsened. Jack pulled open the truck door. Tom groaned, clutching his ribs. "Broken," Jack muttered. "We need shelter, fast." He glanced at Eddie, who was shaking from both cold and panic. "There's a church down the road. Can you walk?" Eddie nodded weakly. The group stumbled through the storm, Rocky leading, his bark keeping them together like a shepherd with his flock. When they reached the small wooden church at the crossroads, its white steeple barely visible through rain, Jack pushed the heavy door open. Inside, candles flickered, and several townsfolk huddled in the pews, seeking refuge from the storm. At the front stood Reverend David Collins. He was in his early 60s, tall and broad-shouldered, though softened by years of pastoral life. His face carried deep creases, but his eyes were warm, steady, and unafraid of suffering. His graying hair was cropped neatly, and he wore a dark sweater instead of robes, practical against the storm. Seeing Jack and the soaked newcomers, Reverend Collins hurried forward. "Lay him down here," he said, motioning to a bench. His voice carried authority without force, the kind of calm that steadied panicked hearts. Jack obeyed, lowering Tom carefully, while Rocky sat guard at his feet, chest heaving from exertion. "War can take your sleep, son," the Reverend said quietly to Jack as he examined Tom, "but it cannot take your kindness." His hand, weathered but steady, gripped Jack's forearm firmly. Jack stiffened at the touch, unaccustomed to open affirmation, but did not pull away. Eddie stared at Jack with wide eyes. "If you hadn't come," he began, but his voice broke. He reached down to stroke Rocky's wet fur. The dog accepted it with a calmness that surprised everyone. A child in the pews whispered, "Guardian angel." The words caught, repeated by others, until laughter, light, tired, but real, filled the church. Among those present was Sarah Bennett, a woman in her late 30s who ran the town's small bakery. Sarah was tall, slender, with chestnut-brown hair tied back in a braid, her green eyes sharp yet kind. She had a reputation for speaking her mind, which sometimes rubbed people the wrong way, but her heart was generous. She approached Jack with a wool blanket, her long fingers trembling slightly as she draped it over his shoulders. "You'll catch pneumonia if you keep standing there drenched," she said matter-of-factly. Jack nodded once, murmuring a hoarse thanks. For Sarah, kindness was a habit. Years earlier, her husband had died in a farming accident, leaving her with no children and a shop to manage alone. That loss had made her fiercely independent, but also more attuned to the quiet pain of others. She studied Jack now, recognizing in him the same shadow of grief she carried. The storm outside raged for hours, but inside the church there was warmth. Reverend Collins organized volunteers to help Tom, while Sarah distributed loaves of bread she had brought. Eddie clung to his uncle's side, tears streaking his rain-soaked cheeks, whispering thanks to Jack and Rocky. Jack sat on a pew, the blanket heavy on his shoulders, Rocky's head resting against his knee. His mind swirled. He had not meant to be a hero. He had not meant to step forward at all. Yet here he was, surrounded by townsfolk who looked at him with respect rather than suspicion. Their gazes pierced the armor he had worn for so long. He felt both exposed and strangely comforted. When the rain eased at last and dawn broke gray and damp, Reverend Collins clasped Jack's hand again. "You've done more than rescue a man tonight," he said. "You reminded us that strength is not only for war, but for each other." Jack said nothing, but in his chest something stirred an ember long thought dead. He looked down at Rocky, whose amber eyes glowed in the pale light. "Guardian angel," the child had said. Maybe the boy was right. Maybe Rocky was more than just a dog. Maybe he was the tether pulling Jack back toward a life worth living. That morning, as the townsfolk dispersed and the storm's damage revealed itself in broken branches and flooded ditches, word of Jack's deed traveled quickly. By evening, in the diner where men gathered for coffee and gossip, people spoke of the veteran and his loyal German shepherd. For the first time in years, Jack Miller's name was carried on the lips of his neighbors, not with pity or distance, but with respect. The storm had passed, leaving the roads littered with broken branches and puddles that reflected a pale gray sky. Jack Miller spent the next day working at the mill, his arms moving automatically as he lifted boards, but his mind kept returning to the church the night before. He had not expected gratitude, nor the warmth in the Reverend's words, nor the way Sarah Bennett's eyes had lingered on him as she laid the blanket over his shoulders. Those moments clung to him like dew on grass, fragile and temporary, yet undeniable. But when night fell, the old demons returned. In the cabin, Shadows moved with each flicker of the oil lamp, and the silence between raindrops was louder than gunfire. Jack lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, when the memory came unbidden. A desert road, headlights slicing darkness, the explosion that tore apart the convoy. He heard the screams again, felt the sand sting his face, smelled the acrid smoke. His body tensed, fists clenching, and sweat rolled down his temple. Rocky stirred from the rug near the bed. The German shepherd lifted his head, amber eyes glowing faint in the lamplight, and patted closer. He rested his chin on the edge of Jack's mattress, ears pricked, as if reminding Jack he was not back there, but here. Jack reached out, his hand trembling, and laid it on Rocky's head. The dog's fur was warm, his steady breathing grounding. Yet even with Rocky beside him, sleep was a battlefield Jack could not win. On Sunday morning, Jack did something he had avoided for years. He walked toward the white church at the crossroads. He wore the same beige shirt, clean but worn, and his faded jeans. His boots tracked dust across the path, and Rocky trotted at his side, tail low, as if sensing the weight of the moment. The church bell tolled gently, calling people in. Inside, families filled the wooden pews, children whispering, women adjusting hats. Jack slipped quietly into the back row, shoulders hunched. He sat rigid, every muscle tense, aware of every glance cast his way. Rocky lay at his feet, ears twitching at the sounds of hymns. Reverend David Collins spoke from the pulpit, his voice carrying calm strength. He read from Scripture about storms and the shelter found in one another. Jack listened, not to the words, but to the cadence, the certainty that seemed to knit the room together. For years, certainty had been absent from his life. When the service ended, Reverend Collins moved through the congregation, shaking hands, listening to stories. When he reached Jack, he did not offer words. He simply placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. The touch was firm, steady, not pitying. Jack's chest tightened. He swallowed hard, nodding once, unable to speak. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah Bennett passed by. She wore a simple blue dress, her braid damp from the humidity, her green eyes catching Jack's for a moment. "Glad you came," she said softly, before slipping out into the sunlight. Jack stood frozen, unsure how to respond, her words echoing like a stone dropped into a still pond. Outside, on the steps, Mrs. Thompson waited. The elderly widow's scarf was pulled tight against the breeze, and in her arms she carried a wicker basket. She smiled gently, her pale blue eyes kind but sharp enough to see through silence. She said nothing, only pressed the basket into Jack's hands. Inside were a loaf of bread, wrapped neatly in cloth, and a small bundle of firewood tied with twine. Before he could thank her, she was already walking down the path, her back straight despite her age. Jack stood on the church steps, Rocky beside him, the weight of the basket in his arms heavier than its contents. For the first time in years, he felt something soft pressing against the walls of his heart. It was not pity. It was care, given quietly, without demand. That made it harder to reject. Back at the cabin, Jack placed the bread on his table and the firewood by the hearth. He sat with his head in his hands, Rocky resting against his knee. The dog's amber eyes lifted, as though asking the question Jack dared not speak aloud. Could he allow himself to be part of this town again? Could he trust their kindness, or would it break him to hope? Night came, and again the nightmares returned. But this time, when Jack jolted awake, gasping, Rocky was already on the bed, his weight pressed against Jack's chest, a living anchor against the storm in his mind. Jack wrapped his arms around the dog, trembling. "You're my guard," he whispered, voice cracked. "My only guard." And though the wounds inside him did not heal, for the first time Jack felt they might not always bleed. The air in town grew heavier with whispers. At the diner where farmers gathered for morning coffee, men spoke in low voices about a string of stolen trucks on the state highway. At the feed store, women shook their heads and drew their children closer. The thefts weren't random, they carried the mark of a crew that planned well and vanished fast. In a place where everyone left their keys on hooks and their doors half open, suspicion was poison. Jack Miller heard the talk, but said little. He worked his hours at the mill, kept Rocky close, and nodded politely when neighbors spoke. Yet, inside, he felt the unease like a vibration beneath his skin. In the desert, he had seen villages hollowed by fear before a shot was ever fired. Rumors alone could unravel trust faster than bullets. One evening, Sarah Bennett stopped by the mill with a basket of rolls. She stood tall in her flour-dusted apron, chestnut hair tucked under a kerchief, her green eyes catching Jack's before he could retreat. "They're saying the thieves were spotted near the old warehouse by the south fields," she said. Her voice was calm, but tension curled beneath. "People are worried." Jack accepted the basket, the warm bread filling his hands. "Worry won't stop them," he muttered. Sarah studied him, seeing the lines deepened by sleepless nights, the weight in his shoulders. She wanted to say more, but she only added, "Just be careful." That night, the air grew cooler, the fields stretching wide beneath a swollen moon. Jack walked the dirt road toward his cabin, Rocky at his side. The German shepherd's sable coat shimmered faintly under silver light, his black saddle standing out like armor. Rocky moved with purpose, ears flicking at every sound, his amber eyes scanning shadows. It was then that Rocky froze. His muscles went taut, fur bristling along his spine. A growl rose low from his throat, not loud, but sharp enough to slice the night. Jack stopped, following the dog's gaze. Across the meadow, near the silhouette of the old warehouse, figures shifted. 3, maybe 4 men, crouched near the loading bay. The faint metallic clink of tools carried on the breeze. Jack's body tightened, instincts honed by years of patrols flooding back. He crouched slightly, his faded jeans brushing wet grass, one hand resting on Rocky's flank to keep him steady. The men were dressed in dark jackets, their outlines angular, purposeful. One of them glanced toward the road, revealing a pale, narrow face with a thin beard, eyes darting nervously. Another, taller with broad shoulders, moved with authority, his posture commanding the others. Jack's eyes narrowed. He memorized details the way a soldier does. The dented pickup parked nearby, its license plate caked in mud except for the last 3 numbers, 247. The direction the truck faced, the angle of the warehouse door. His mind cataloged everything, each image stamped into memory. Rocky pressed closer, his growl steady but controlled. Jack whispered, "Easy, boy." His heart pounded, but he did not let fear take root. Fear clouded memory, and memory was his weapon now. The men worked quickly, prying open the warehouse door, whispering curses when the hinges groaned. Jack recognized the efficiency. These weren't drifters stealing for a night's meal, they were organized. Dangerous. He thought of the villagers he had seen years ago, farmers who had lost everything when armed men decided to take what wasn't theirs. He had sworn then, silently, that he would never let evil go unanswered again, not if he had a choice. And here, in this quiet Ohio town that had begun to embrace him, the choice lay before him. He exhaled slowly, turned, and guided Rocky back along the road. The dog resisted for a moment, ears locked on the figures, but obeyed. They slipped into the cover of trees, the moonlight breaking into fractured beams overhead. When they were far enough that only crickets and the rustle of leaves surrounded them, Jack took a final glance back. The men were still there, shadows against the warehouse, unaware they had been seen. At dawn, Jack stood in the small sheriff's office in town. Sheriff Harold Jenkins was a man in his late 50s, tall but beginning to stoop, his belly pressing against the buttons of his tan uniform shirt. His once black mustache was mostly gray now, thick above a mouth that rarely smiled. Deep lines framed his eyes, the result of years spent reading people's lies. He had served in law enforcement since his 20s, seen the slow erosion of trust in both criminals and law-abiding folk alike. Jack laid the details out plainly: the location, the number of men, the plate ending in 247. Jenkins listened, tapping a pencil against his desk. His blue eyes, weary but sharp, studied Jack with a mix of skepticism and respect. "You're sure?" he asked. Jack's voice was steady. "As sure as I ever was overseas." Rocky, sitting at his side, thumped his tail once as if confirming. The sheriff leaned back, rubbing his mustache. "You've given us more than rumors. That's something. We'll look into it." He hesitated, then added, "Appreciate you not taking this into your own hands." Jack met his gaze, unflinching. "I've seen whole towns destroyed because no one spoke up. I won't let that happen here." Jenkins nodded slowly. For a moment, the 2 men regarded each other not as sheriff and citizen, but as men who had both carried burdens too heavy to set down. When Jack left the office, the morning sun spread across the fields, painting the golden maples in light. Rocky trotted beside him, his body brushing Jack's leg. The dog looked up, amber eyes steady, as if to say, "We did our part." Jack reached down, resting a calloused hand on his dog's back. For the first time, he didn't feel like a man watching from the margins. He felt like a guardian, standing with his town against the cost. Darkness. The night descended heavy with humidity, clouds gathering like bruises across the Ohio sky. Jack Miller sat on his porch, Rocky sprawled nearby, when the first drops of rain spattered against the roof. By the time he rose, pulling on his faded coat, the storm had broken loose. Sheets of rain slashed the fields, and thunder rolled like artillery across the hills. Rocky stood alert, ears pricked, his sable coat already damp, his amber eyes glinting with unease. Jack's instincts prickled too. Storms never came alone in his memory. They carried danger, confusion, and shadows. He decided to make a quick patrol near the southern fields. Sheriff Harold Jenkins had promised to investigate the warehouse break-in, but Jack knew criminals didn't wait for paperwork. He walked the muddy path with Rocky at his side, the rain soaking his beige shirt until it clung to his broad shoulders. Each lightning flash carved the world into harsh outlines. Barns hunched low, trees bent under the wind, fences gleaming slick with water. As they neared the old warehouse, Rocky froze. His body stiffened, tail straight, hackles rising. Jack followed his gaze. Through the slanting rain, dark figures moved along the edge of the building. The thieves. The men Jack had seen before. This time, however, they were not oblivious. A shout cut through the storm. One of the figures had spotted them. "Hey!" a harsh voice barked. Flashlights cut arcs through the rain, beams slashing across the meadow. Jack's heart surged into his throat. Rocky growled low, a rumble against the thunder. The men gave chase, their boots slapping through mud. Jack grabbed Rocky's collar and sprinted toward the open fields. The rain turned the ground slick, every step a battle against slipping. Behind them, curses rang out, the beams of flashlights bouncing wildly. Jack's military instincts roared awake. He scanned the terrain with a soldier's eye, the dips in the earth, the clusters of trees, the rhythm of lightning. "Easy, boy," he whispered, even as his lungs burned. "We've run worse." A lightning flash split the sky, throwing their pursuers into stark relief. 4 men, one tall and broad with a heavy frame, another lean with a thin beard clinging to his jaw, 2 more with hunched shoulders and quick strides. They carried metal pipes and crowbars, gleaming whenever the light caught them. Jack veered toward a shallow ditch. He slid down, pulling Rocky with him, and pressed against the earth as darkness returned after the flash. The men stumbled past, disoriented by the sudden blindness that follows lightning. Jack waited, counting his breaths, rainwater pooling in his collar. When thunder rolled again, he moved, slipping silently behind a row of hedges. Rocky stayed close, crouched low, his muscles quivering but obedient. Jack remembered teaching recruits to use shadows, to let storms hide their movements. Now, in a small Ohio field, the lesson returned. He whispered, "On me." But fate had other plans. A sudden bark from Rocky broke the silence. The dog lunged, teeth bared, seizing the leg of the thin-bearded man who had doubled back. The man shrieked, crashing into the mud. His flashlight flew from his grasp, landing beam up to cast grotesque shadows across the field. The other thieves wheeled around, shouting. Jack had no time to hesitate. He hurled himself forward, boot connecting with another man's knee, sending him sprawling. Pain shot through Jack's side where old injuries protested, but adrenaline drowned it out. "Move, Rocky," he barked. The dog released, sprang back, then circled to shield Jack's flank. The tall ringleader cursed, swinging a pipe. Lightning flared, showing his face. Sharp nose, scars etched across one cheek, eyes burning with ruthless calculation. He swung, but Jack ducked, the pipe slicing empty air. Jack countered with a shoulder slam that drove the man back into the mud. The storm was their ally and enemy, both. Each flash revealed everything. Each thunderclap masked their movements. Jack used the rhythm, darting when light blinded their pursuers, crouching when darkness covered. Rocky moved with him, a seamless partner. Together, they turned chaos into tactics, but they were outnumbered, and Jack knew staying would mean capture or worse. He shoved Rocky toward the tree line, retreating in bursts timed to lightning. The thieves, disoriented and angry, chased but faltered in the mire. By the time they regrouped, Jack and Rocky had vanished into the woods. They didn't stop until the cabin loomed through sheets of rain. Jack collapsed against the porch rail, gasping, his chest heaving. Rocky shook himself violently, water spraying everywhere, before pressing against Jack's leg, body still tense but alive. Jack dropped to his knees in the mud and wrapped both arms around the dog. His beard scratched against Rocky's wet fur, and his voice cracked with raw relief. "You're not the comrades I left behind," he whispered into the storm. "But you're the comrade God sent me now," Rocky huffed softly, pressing his weight closer, as thunder rolled away into the distance. The storm had left its scars across the countryside. Fallen branches blocked narrow roads, mud sucked at boots, and puddles mirrored the steel-gray sky. Jack Miller walked with a stiff gait that morning, his ribs sore from the previous night's struggle, but his eyes remained sharp. Rocky padded at his side, fur still damp, his black saddle slick with water. The German shepherd moved with purpose, ears pricked as if ready for another call to duty. Jack knew the fight with the thieves was not the end. It was only the beginning. Before sunrise, he had sent word to Sheriff Harold Jenkins through Sarah Bennett. Sarah had arrived at Jack's cabin with a basket of rolls wrapped in linen, her hair pulled back into a braid, her cheeks flushed from the morning chill. Her tall, slender figure looked fragile in the mist, but her green eyes held resolve. "I'll carry your message," she told Jack after he described what he had seen. Her voice was low but steady. "But be careful, they're dangerous men." She left quickly, her steps crisp against the wet grass, and Jack had felt an unfamiliar warmth at her concern. By noon, Jenkins appeared at the cabin, his tan uniform soaked at the shoulders. With him came two deputies, Calvin Reed and Martin Blake. Reed was a wiry man in his 30s, his jawline sharp, his dark hair cut close. A burn scar curled down his left forearm, a mark from the barn fire years ago that had shaped his stubborn bravery. He had a restless energy, as though always fighting something unseen. Blake, in contrast, was broader, his blonde hair thinning at the crown, his thick mustache making him look perpetually stern. Nearing 50, he was cautious, sometimes too slow, but his steadiness was valued when tempers flared. Jack briefed them quickly, recounting what he had seen near the warehouse. Jenkins listened without interrupting, his blue eyes narrowed. "We'll check it out," he said, then turned to Rocky, who stood alert at Jack's knee. "That dog seems sharper than half my men." Jack allowed a rare flicker of pride to cross his face. They set out together, Jack walking point with Rocky. The woods were damp, branches dripping, the air filled with the earthy smell of decay. Rocky sniffed, then lowered his head, tugging slightly at his leash. His muscles quivered with certainty. "He's got something," Jack murmured. Jenkins signaled for silence, his deputies unslinging flashlights, though daylight filtered weakly through the canopy. The dog led them off the main path, weaving through brambles until they reached a clearing. There stood a shack, slumped and rotting, its tin roof caved in places, walls patched with plywood. Despite its ruined state, there were clear signs of recent use: tire tracks in the mud, cigarette butts crushed near the door, and the faint scent of smoke. Rocky's body stiffened. He circled the shack, nose pressed low, tail rigid. Then he barked short, urgent, and insistent. Jack recognized the sound immediately. It was not aggression, it was a signal. "Something's inside," Jack whispered. Jenkins nodded, and the deputies moved to the door. Rusted hinges groaned as they forced it open. The interior smelled of mildew and sweat. Rocky lunged forward, sniffing frantically, then barked at a corner where old tarps lay heaped. His bark grew sharper, echoing like an alarm. Reed pulled back the tarps with rough hands. Beneath them lay a man bound with ropes, his face pale, lips cracked, eyes wide with fear. His brown hair was matted, his shirt torn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Jack knelt instantly, pulling a pocket knife from his jeans to cut the ropes. The man coughed weakly, voice hoarse. They kept me here, said I saw too much. Please." It was Henry Dalton, a farmer from the northern fields. Henry had always been known in town as a gentle soul, quick with jokes at the feed store, his strong back bent over rows of strawberries in summer. Now his sturdy frame looked withered, his gray eyes clouded with exhaustion. Jenkins steadied him with a hand, muttering, "Easy, Henry, you're safe now." Henry gasped as the ropes fell away, his body trembling. He clutched Jack's sleeve, whispering, "I thought I'd never leave that corner alive." Rocky whined softly, pressing his muzzle against Henry's hand, as if to reassure him. The man broke into tears, stroking the dog's damp fur. Blake glanced around the shack, his mustache twitching. "They'll be back. This place isn't just a hideout, it's a cage." His voice was grim. Jenkins ordered his deputies to secure the site and call for backup. As they led Henry outside, Jack lingered at the doorway, rain dripping down his beard. He watched Rocky, who paced close, amber eyes alight, his body thrumming with triumph. Jack felt his chest tighten. He thought of soldiers he had lost, comrades whose bodies he couldn't carry home, names carved into his memory like scars. His voice cracked as he dropped to one knee, hands trembling as he stroked Rocky's head. "I lost brothers once, men I couldn't save," he whispered. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "But today, because of you, someone came home. You're the comrade God sent me for this life." Rocky leaned against him, warm and solid, rain dripping from his sable fur. In that moment, Jack realized the dog was not just a guardian of his nights, but a bridge to healing, a present gift against old wounds. Sunday sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the old church, painting the wooden pews with soft hues of gold and red. The air carried the scent of baked bread and roasted chicken, drifting from the fellowship hall where townsfolk had gathered. Word of Henry Dalton's rescue had spread quickly, traveling faster than gossip usually allowed. In small towns, stories took root in hearts as swiftly as they spread across lips. Today, the story of a veteran and his German shepherd had become something more. It was a tale of hope. Jack Miller had hesitated before coming. He had stood outside the church doors, beige shirt freshly laundered, his jeans clean but still faded, boots polished as best he could manage. He smoothed his short chestnut hair, streaked with silver, but the mirror of his mind still reflected a soldier who did not belong among laughter and light. Rocky stood beside him, sable coat brushed and gleaming, amber eyes watching Jack carefully, sensing his reluctance. With a low huff, the dog nudged his leg, urging him forward. Inside, conversations hushed when Jack entered. For a heartbeat, silence filled the room. Then, slowly, the elders rose from their seats. Men with weathered faces, women with hair turned white with years, they stood and began to clap. It was not polite applause, but a rising tide, steady and warm, like the way crowds had once welcomed soldiers home after the Great Wars. Jack's throat tightened, his scar along his temple burning as if memory collided with the present. He stood rigid, every instinct urging him to flee, but the sound of clapping held him fast. Children broke the stillness next. They rushed toward Rocky, small hands reaching, laughter echoing. Rocky wagged his tail, lowering his head to let them stroke his ears, his amber eyes softening. "Hero!" one boy shouted. "Guardian angel!" another added. The nickname spread quickly, until the room echoed with children's voices celebrating the dog as if he were a knight from their bedtime tales. At the front, Reverend David Collins smiled, his tall frame steady as always, his lined face softened by joy. He raised a hand for quiet, then spoke, his voice calm but strong. "In times of fear, God sends us reminders that courage does not end on battlefields. It begins again in our homes." Jack Miller and his companion have reminded us of that truth. His eyes found Jack's, steady and without pity. Jack lowered his gaze, but a flicker of warmth stirred inside him. From among the children stepped a boy no older than 10. His name was Samuel Carter, thin and freckled, his sandy hair sticking up in tufts. His clothes were hand-me-downs, slightly too large, his sneakers scuffed. Samuel's father had left years ago, and his mother, a tired woman who cleaned houses, raised him alone. Despite hardship, Samuel's eyes shone with the unshakable faith of youth. In his hands, he clutched an old, folded American flag, its edges frayed, its colors faded. He approached Jack with trembling steps, holding the flag out with both hands. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but in the silence of the hall it carried, "You're a real hero, sir. Please take this." Jack stared at the flag. His chest constricted, as if invisible hands pressed against his ribs. Slowly, with hands that shook more than he wanted, he accepted the flag. The fabric was worn but heavy with meaning. He saw battlefields in its stripes, graves in its stars, and faces of brothers who had never come home. His vision blurred, tears rising unbidden. He knelt, bringing himself level with Samuel. His voice cracked as he said, "Thank you, son. This means more than you'll ever know." Samuel's eyes widened, a smile breaking across his face, as though he had just delivered treasure to a king. Sarah Bennett watched from near the table, her tall frame poised, her chestnut hair braided neatly. She had brought trays of pastries from her bakery, the sweet scent filling the hall. Her green eyes softened as she saw Jack clutching the flag. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt hope stir, not only for herself, but for the man standing before her. She stepped closer, pressing a mug of coffee into Jack's hands. "It's strong," she said lightly. "Figured you could use it." Jack managed a faint smile, though his eyes still glistened. Henry Dalton, still weak but recovering, sat nearby, his gray eyes grateful. "If not for you and that dog," he said hoarsely, "I'd still be in that shack or worse." Jack shook his head. "If not for this town, I wouldn't have had the strength to act. We all played a part. Yet, deep down, he knew Rocky had been the anchor. Without him, Jack would never have found the courage to step beyond his shadows." The meal began, laughter filling the hall as plates were passed, hands clasped, stories traded. Jack remained quiet, eating slowly. Rocky stretched at his feet, but when he glanced around, he no longer felt the outsider. The applause still echoed in his chest, the flag pressed against his thigh like a heartbeat, and the boy's words lingered, "You're a real hero." Later, when the hall emptied and dusk settled over the churchyard, Jack stood outside beneath the fading sky. The flag was clutched in his calloused hands. Rocky pressed close, ears flicking at the evening breeze. Jack whispered, voice low but steady, "The nightmares are still here. The scars won't vanish. But maybe I don't have to face them alone." For the first time in years, the weight of solitude eased. He was still a man haunted, but now he was a man held. The golden light of autumn slanted across the fields, painting the maples in hues of amber and scarlet. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and bread, mingling with the sound of hammers and laughter. Where once an abandoned house had stood empty and forgotten at the edge of town, life now stirred again. The townsfolk had chosen it for Jack Miller, a gift born not from pity but from gratitude and respect. Jack stood in the yard, sleeves rolled up, jeans streaked with dust, as he watched the transformation. The house itself was modest, 2 stories of weathered timber with a sagging roof, its shutters long gone. But now, carpenters climbed the rafters, nailing new shingles into place. Frank Turner, a burly man in his 50s, with a thick black beard, shot through with white, led the work. He had been a carpenter all his life, his calloused hands steady even after decades. Frank had lost a son in Iraq, and though grief had carved deep lines into his face, today his blue eyes shone as he worked. "This place'll stand another 50 years, Jack," he said, voice rough but proud. "On the porch, Mrs." Thompson, the widow with silver hair, always tucked beneath her scarf, sat in a rocking chair brought from her own porch. She directed children with a firm but kind voice, handing them brushes dripping with white paint. Her pale eyes sparkled as she watched them slap color across the picket fence, giggling when drops spattered their shoes. "Keep it steady now," she called, chuckling. "A hero needs a fence that doesn't wobble." Sarah Bennett arrived with trays of bread and pies, her tall, slender frame moving gracefully despite the baskets she carried. Her chestnut braids swung against her back, and her green eyes softened when they fell on Jack. She set the trays on a table in the yard and brushed flour from her apron. "You'll need more than nails and paint to build a home," she teased gently. "Bread holds walls together, too." Jack managed a smile, one that reached his eyes this time. Rocky bounded through the yard, tail wagging furiously, weaving between workers and children. His sable coat gleamed in the sun, and his amber eyes danced with joy. He barked once at the sound of hammering, then darted off to chase a stick thrown by a boy. The children shouted, "Guardian Angel!" as they ran after him, their laughter ringing through the crisp air. To them, Rocky was no longer just a dog. He was a symbol of safety and courage, as real as any uniformed protector. Henry Dalton, still recovering but stronger by the day, arrived carrying a bundle of lumber balanced across his shoulder. His gray eyes were tired but grateful. "Figured I owed you a few boards, Jack," he said. His strawberry farm had survived because Jack and Rocky had found him, and Henry's presence at the build was his quiet way of repaying a debt he felt too deep to name. Sheriff Jenkins stopped by in the afternoon, his uniform shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his mustache damp with sweat. He leaned against a post, watching as townsfolk worked shoulder to shoulder. His steel blue eyes softened as he caught Jack's glance. "You've given this town back its backbone," he said simply. And for Jenkins, who rarely wasted words, it was praise heavier than medals. As the day wore on, the abandoned house shed its old skin. The roof shone with new shingles, the fence gleamed with fresh paint, and the smell of pine boards replaced the mustiness of decay. Women brought quilts, bright with patterns stitched over the years. Men stacked firewood by the porch. Teenagers hauled buckets of nails, eager to prove their strength. It was not just a repair, it was a resurrection. When the last nail was driven and the tools set aside, dusk spread golden across the yard. Jack sat on the wide porch steps, his hands raw, his shirt damp with sweat. Rocky lay stretched at his feet, chest rising and falling, content after a day of running and playing guard. Children still chased one another across the yard, their laughter carrying into the evening. Mrs. Thompson rocked gently in her chair, her scarf fluttering in the breeze, her smile serene as she watched. Jack held the old flag Samuel Carter had given him at the church supper. The fabric felt rough but alive in his hands. He looked around at the people, gathered the carpenter with sawdust still in his beard, Sarah with flour on her cheek, Henry leaning on a fence he had helped paint, the sheriff standing quiet at the edge of the crowd. It was not the house that overwhelmed him, but the faces. He lowered his gaze to Rocky. The dog lifted his head, amber eyes steady as always. Jack's voice was husky, almost lost in the autumn wind. "You're not just a dog, you're family. And because of you, I've found more than a house. I've found a community again." Rocky huffed softly, tail thumping against the porch. The golden light deepened, wrapping man and dog in its glow, as if sealing the promise of a new beginning. From the loneliness of a weathered cabin to the laughter of children painting a new fence, Jack Miller's journey became more than survival, it became renewal. Haunted by scars of war and the silence of PTSD, he once believed life had left him behind. Yet, through the steadfast loyalty of Rocky, a sable German shepherd with eyes like burning amber, Jack found not only companionship, but a path back to community. The town that once saw him as distant came to embrace him as family. Neighbors brought bread, children brought laughter, elders brought respect, and together they raised more than walls, they rebuilt hope. What began as one man's silent struggle became a living testimony that healing is never found in isolation, but in faith, loyalty, and the quiet hands of others reaching out. Even in brokenness, God plants seeds of healing. Jack thought his story ended in silence, but through Rocky, through kindness, through community, God reminded him and us that miracles are not always thunderous. Sometimes they come as a loyal dog, a neighbor's loaf of bread, or a child's smile. In your life, too, there are unseen blessings waiting to bloom. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so we can keep telling these stories of faith, courage, and second chances. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and endless love.